This morning we're going to do a different exercise. We're going to build a Caribbean-based artisanal fishing boat, which is aptly called a pirogue. And this is going to be a scratch build. And we're going to be using local Caribbean mahogany and perhaps a few pieces of hardwood thrown in. The build is going to follow a book written by Richard Hubbard, a close friend who was a scientist with the Institute of Marine Affairs. He's now retired, and he's, like myself, an avid woodworker. The traditional way of making fishing boats in Trinidad is quite interesting. The first thing they do is lay the keel, then they put the stem on. Once that's securely attached, they put the planks and use spreaders to keep the boat spread apart. Then eventually they'll put the stern on, and the last thing they add are the frames or ribs to the boat. So it's quite interesting and quite different, and certainly very different than how we make models. The first thing we do is create the stock, and ironically, I went up to Richard Hubbard's woodworking shop, went into his junk pile and pulled out a whole bunch of Caribbean mahogany, and I've made it up, and I'll have a list of these in the description so that you can find out. Very inexpensive, small bunch. The biggest piece is the piece needed for the keel. Then once that is done, I have a building board that I'll secure the keel to, and I shape the keel and start planking the boat. The first challenge is making up the keel, and I did this on the mill. It was quite easy to do. It normally would be done with chisels and a curved plane. In my case, it was very easy on the mill. Then we made up the stem, and this is the only place you'll actually see a formal rabbet, because the way the planks were added is simply they were butt joined to the keel. Once the keel was finished, it was time to put the planks on, and I decided to use some 30-minute epoxy because there's nothing holding the plank to the keel, because there are no frames installed yet in this traditional method of building the boat. Lots of clamps, really struggled to get the first one in because the rabbet was not there, and a lot of planing of the surface to get it right. This then is the second challenge, to plane that keel and the plank to get it to fit properly. Port side now stuck, not as hard as the starboard side, but still that major bend really is a challenge. This is probably the hardest part of the whole build, getting the garboard planks on, and after a few attempts and a few corrections, I finally got it right. So the rest of it should be fairly easy. And because there are no ribs in place, now is the ideal time to clean up the inside of the planks. These fishing boats were clinker built, and the next board is going to fit over the garboard plank like that. But the angle here is going to change because this has been sweeping upwards, and that's one of the characteristics of a Caribbean pirogue. So we need to re-establish the angle to cut the next plank. The other thing we need to do is the garboard plank, we need to take it down so that we don't have too much of the second plank protruding out. So we're going to take this down probably by about half, and we're calculating the overlap, and the overlap is about 2 inches. So as a guide, we're just marking it so we can easily see it as we go along. You'll notice we are also changing to PVA glue, and we're going to use this for the balance of the build. Today we're going to use the coffee pot method for steaming the wood. As you know, I tend to boil the wood rather than steam it. So we're going to bring the kettle up to boil and leave it in there for about 5 minutes, and then we'll bend it on the hull itself. From the second plank up, the bend isn't as critical or difficult, and I prefer to make sure I've locked in the bend. So you will find that I will use the blow dryer once it sets to really heat it and dry the wood quickly. And I find once I do that, the bend doesn't come back out, it stays locked in. Also, to make sure I have a nice, tight, even glue joint, once you have no shortage of clamps, I'd use every clamp you have. And again, clean up with a dry brush or a wet brush. This is really the easiest time to do the cleanup, and I strongly advise it. Once we've put the third clamp in place and stuck, it's time to now look at the final shape, and so we'll have to start using the spreaders and either push it out or pull it in. I was having some issues with the wood bending at different rates, and the sides started to take on a different shape. So I decided to make up the stern and use the stern to hold everything in place so I'd have symmetry on both sides. This was dealt with in a rail boat by nailing spacers all along the center. I just don't want to do that. To help keep this correct shape, again I went back to the heating blow dryer and really put the blow dryer on for a good minute or so, and then let it cool, and this will hold the shape in place. As you can see, we've recessed plank number 3 to take the 4th plank. That's done, that's recessed about a foot, maybe up to 2 feet. And then as we start to go back, we put the plane and started to sharpen the edge, because this is the major change as we want the plank to start becoming more upright. We've put the starboard side on, and I must say I'm struggling without the braces to try and make sure that the bend is exactly the same. I think in hindsight I should have made up some braces with the correct angles already placed on them. But of course I have no idea what that angle should be until you actually bend the board. So on with the last port plank. Having installed the last plank, it's time to make an assessment of where we've reached, particularly in reference to the build that is displayed in Richard's book. And we made a few observations. First of all, you may notice I have a little support here on the side. And what has happened is, as I've built the model, the wood on either side is slightly different, has different strengths, so there's a natural twist that took place of the model to the left. And I've compensated for this by clamping the back down and using the blow dryer to heat both sides of it to try and get it re-stabilized. And it's almost back to keeping a level stern. The second observation I made is that on the back of the boat, you can see it's clinker built, but when you look at the boat in the book, they make reference to the planks flattening at the back, which means that they were recessed into each other, very much like the bow, to bring them, if not close to a flat surface, fairly close, so that when you go to make the back itself on the, and I'm making reference to the flat area, which is the first two, maybe to the third board, it's relatively flat. There's not that clinker board over board aspect right at the back. The third error, and there are lots of errors I made, is that board number board number 4 was actually reduced in half. I don't know why I didn't see that. The result of which is that the sides went up too high, particularly the back. At the bow, that's not so important. So for this model, I've planed the last board back down to half its size, and the result is I'm actually going to start a second model which will correct that error. The next observation I made is that they actually show a photograph of the bow being tapered, no explanation made, and that would reduce the height that that the bow would go, because of the nature of the bend, the planks just keep raising higher and higher. My guess is that's going to be a personal preference. If you look at a lot of the pirogues around our country here, you'll see the bows exceptionally high, which means to me that there was no taper. Yet there are others where the rise at the bow was much more gentle, and that again indicates that there was a taper. Another error that was made is that this boat was supposed to end up at 25 feet, and it's ending up at 23 feet. And the reason for that is the angle that I put the bow, which the book refers to as a personal choice. The angle was not as sharp as I'm looking at it now, and that certainly would have added a foot and a half. Not sure it would have got to the 2 feet. Perhaps the biggest error made is following the build, and the book doesn't say exactly when the stern was attached. But the long and short of it is that I have ended up with a stern that is a foot and a half wider than the ratio indicates for this model. And this is the correct size of stern. So quite clearly, to help keep this back shape, you need to put the stern on as soon as possible. And my guess that would be once you have at least 2 planks off the keel on either side, that's the time to stick the stern on. They have it that they put it on by the 3rd plank. By then it was probably too late for me. The angle that the stern is set, in my model I put it flat because I'm actually building a rowing pirogue. When outboard engines were added, you had to have an angle leaning backwards, and that angle was determined to be 2.5 degrees. It's your preference. In the second boat, I will put the 2.5 degrees simply to reflect the book, but it's a builder's choice. I think I will bring this to an end now. I think we've covered all of the misinterpretations or errors, if you prefer, on the build so far. I think the very nature of how Richard Hubbard went about recording the information, because in a sense there's no plan that was followed, that each builder had slight different preferences. He tended to rely on ratios rather than exact measurements, with the belief that as I said, each builder would build it slightly differently, and what he was really recording was how the boats were put together. So I plan to actually make the actual drawings of this when it's all done, and have firm measurements so that anybody who wants to actually build one of these things will have actual dimensions to follow. In part 2, I'm going to start with the second model, which has the stern corrected and the shorter plank on the side corrected. I will extend the angle of the stem slightly, another 5 degrees, and that should give me the correct length. And then we'll concentrate on the internal parts of the boat, particularly making the ribs, which of course vary from boat to boat and were fitted in situ, so they match the shape of the individual boat.